Hello. This is our last lecture for Walter Wink for Theology 345. I'm Greg Jones, Dr. Greg Jones, and I'll be taking you through this last portion of this session. Remember, we have three books that we'll be reading. Walter Wink's The Powers That Be, Jacques L. Ewell, The Presence of the Kingdom, and then we'll finish up with portions of Bonhoeffer's The Call to Discipleship. I'm sorry. So, let's begin. I want to do a review for Just War for you. Let's just review a bit. I left one item out that I want to touch base with from last time, so this is a connection to the last lecture that we had. I want to remind you that the just war theory that we talked about last time fell to Augustine to accommodate Christianity to its new status as a privileged religion in support of the state. Augustine kind of promoted the notion of wars being just, and I want to talk to you a little about an aspect of just war that we hadn't touched upon. One of the main ways in which wars are justified is holy war. I forgot to talk to you about that last time. I want to talk to you about that today, crusades. If you know anything about the crusades, then we know that there have been multiple crusades that have been done to deal with the issue of bringing Christianity to the world. The first crusade, the second crusade, and the third crusade, the children's crusade, were all crusades that were done by the early church to bring to the world Christianity in Christ. We also see lots of film, and we see lots of history dealing with the crusades in the opposition of Islam to Christianity. And even today, we know that that's a conversation that's taking place a lot in terms of the kinds of things that are happening between Islam and Christianity in the world today. So when we talk about crusades, holy war crusades, that is one other way in which war is justified. So let's go over the three again. The holy war or crusades, political wars or wars for national interest, and then machismo and egocentricity. Those are the three main ways in which wars are fought. Just wars are seen to be different than those major threes, but they really aren't, because within those three ways of understanding war, just wars are given validity. And so I want to just touch base with that. And then I want to talk to you a little about how Wink sees the church's vocation in addressing just war theory. We talked about just war theory last time in relationship to how there's a criteria, a 10-point criteria. I won't go over that with you now. You can look at the last video about that. But I want to also talk to you about how the church has a vocation to reform itself around the issue of nonviolence and to challenge just wars and to challenge these various wars that we see in society, as well as begin to talk about how we can move beyond pacifism. So let's turn to page 144 if you have your text before you. And I'm going to just touch base with something that Wink is saying to us in regards to the church's vocation. He says, governments will still wrestle with the option of war. Ethicists can perhaps assist them with their decisions, but the church's own witness should be understandable by the smallest child. We oppose violence in all its forms. That means the child will recognize no abuse or beatings. The church's own witness will be understandable by the smallest child. We oppose violence in all its forms. That means women will hear no rape or violation or battering. This means men will come to understand no more male supremacy or war. This means that everyone will realize no more degradation of the environment. We can affirm nonviolence without reservation because nonviolence is the way God's domination, free order is coming. So Wink really feels that this notion of nonviolence is the church's need to reform toward. and that this nonviolence is the way that we should be living as Christians. This is the Reformation that Wink is presenting to us. I want to go over one aspect of how he touches base with this. On page 148, he talks about O'Gorman. O'Gorman is a woman that is dealing with, let's talk about that story a bit, that's dealing with an intruder that comes into her home. And basically, she says that instead of trying to fight this guy off or trying to shoot this guy, she reasoned with this individual. She wanted to do practical nonviolence, and when this guy crawls into her window, instead of her, shouting and throwing things and fighting with him, she begins to talk with him. I want you to read that story, and I want you to have some discussion about why you think that was a practical or impractical way. Given the kind of violence we see in society, how should one react when violence is propositioned to you in relationship? We just saw a event that happened in Chicago, for example, where two people were chased by a group of young men out into Lakeshore Drive, and one lady was hit and killed, and another man was hit and injured. How should you respond to violence when violence shows up? And violence will show up in a culture of violence, in a tradition of violence. We do see how violence, what Wink is suggesting to us, as Christians, we have a responsibility to respond nonviolently. I want to touch base again with Wink in his work and just focus in on what he suggests us about violence reduction criteria. On page 139 and 138 and 137, he begins to, starting at 136 actually, he starts to talk about a role for violence reduction criteria. And basically what he's saying is that the church needs to begin to advocate for the world and for society a violence reduction criteria. He begins this chapter by talking about how violence has increased as wars have been fought, world wars have been fought, Civil War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam War, Korean War, the war in Iraq, the Desert Storm War, all these wars that are being fought. He says the amount of violence that happens to people. Now, and when he counts people, he's not just talking about soldiers here. He's talking about civilian populations as well. So he's talking about the official count, and then he's talking about the collateral damage of how we fight wars. And so he's looking at that. And he's saying that the church ought to advocate a reformation of reduction, a violence reduction criteria. And he begins on 136 with that. As he goes through this and gives some rationale for this, he says, I propose on page 139 that we terminate all talk of just wars. Even as the word pacifism sounds too much like passivity, just war sounds too much like war is justifiable. The very term is saturated with illusions about the rightness of war that no longer is acceptable. Those who regard all wars as criminal can scarcely use this helpful criteria when they are forced to discuss them within a framework that is basically inadequate. He talks about a violence reduction criteria, and basically he says both advocates of nonviolence and just war theory agree on several key points. One, both acknowledge that nonviolence is the principle preferable to violence. Two, both agree that innocence must be protected as much as possible. Three, both reject any defense of a war motivated solely by crusade mentality or national interest or personal egocentricity. Both wish to persuade states to reduce the levels of violence, and both wish to hold war accountable to moral values before, during, and after conflict. Violence is contrary, Wink says, to the gospel. So he's pushing this, and he's beginning to raise these questions with us. What he's beginning to say to us, finally, is that we need to begin, there are certain things that we need to do in order to address these concerns and be prepared to deal with the reality of a world that is domination-free. He talks about several things in the end of this text that is very, very important. And he talks about three things that I want to touch base with today. to end this work with us. He talks about praying in the powers, and basically he talks about the gift of the enemy, and he talks about how we can see the enemy as a gift. Now imagine that. In the last chapter, chapter 9, he talks about the gift of the enemy. And he says basically God gives us the opportunity to see, not only see the enemy as a part of creation, but to see the enemy as a part of ourselves. And so one way to get to this place of seeing the gift of the enemy is to recognize God's inclusiveness in relationship to the creation of all. Now imagine this in relationship to, say, ISIS or some other terrorist group, where we say, you know, these are human beings, whether or not we want to view them at it and their acts as being violent and animalistic, however we want to see it. We need to recognize that there's humanity in all people, and there's certain things that have happened to people that make them act the way they do. And so he talks about the gift of the enemy in chapter 9. And he talks about God is all inclusive in relationship to that. And then he says, and he gives you a couple of examples of that. And he talks about, he uses how a Nazi hate person begins to harass a Jewish person, and how this and how this Jewish person, instead of being angry and hateful, begins to find ways in which to love this person that is hateful and doing hateful things toward it. And it's a fascinating story. Wink has a fascinating, provocative way of getting us to see this. Talks about the enemy as a gift. And then he talks about love being able to transform people. He uses this story to get us to see how love can transform. And he gives an example of that. And he talks about, he says, identifying enemies runs the risk of freezing them in their role and of blocking their conversation. Treating people as enemies will help create enemy-like reactions in them. To greater emphasis on liberating the oppressed, to bigger focus on success in nonviolent campaigns, too pragmatic an orientation to nonviolent struggle can have the effect of dehumanizing the opponent in our minds and acts. And so he's getting at underneath how we should act with individuals. He says love can literally transform. Now, the other thing he talks about in prayers and the power, he talks about in terms of prayer and the worldview, he's saying that basically our prayers together can change things. And what we need to be about the business of doing is we need to learn how prayer and see how prayer can operate in the vocation of the church in a powerful way. Now imagine this. I want you to think about this for a minute. What if, instead of droning and bombing, what if the nation reset itself and did what it did in Old Testament time, which is to put on sackcloth and ashes and begin to pray for peace and pray for the change in the world? How would that affect the world? Do you think that that is an unrealistic, or do you think that's a naive way of looking at the world today? Have we exercised the power of prayer in a way in which we could see it operating in the world today? Wink suggests to us at the end of this text is that we need to pray living in the expectation of miracles. And what I would like to finalize with this particular text, I think is a very provocative text. I think this text, what this text has done for us is it's shown us a provocative way of looking at the reformation of the Christian church today. For too long, the church has been set in a standard where it has okayed violence and violent activity. It has become almost a state church, a church that is more about the business of celebrating patriotism than dealing with the teachings and the followings of Jesus Christ. Now, I make that bold statement to you so that you can begin to look at ways in which this Reformation holds true. I think he's on point in terms of the powers. I think he's on point in terms of the institutions and how the institutions have become corrupted, have fallen, if you will, and need to be redeemed. I also think he's on point about nonviolence and Jesus' third way, as we talked about in the early lectures. I think we have not exercised our freedom in Christ Jesus to respond to violence in a culture of violence, in a society of violence, in the way that Jesus would want us to respond. And so I want you to take a look at this, and from the powers as institutions and the things that we talked about early on, to this notion of just war, to this notion of the gift of the enemy, to this notion of Jesus in the third way and the anti-standing, making a stand. How does the church, in a Reformation way, take a stand? I think this is a kairos moment, kairos meaning a moment of truth for the church in terms of Reformation. I think that we are being challenged as a community to address the concerns of being nonviolence. And I think nonviolence means more than just about the business of not doing war, being materialistic, or being militarily being challenging and all opposing to the world. I think that the challenge is for us to excise violence out of our lifestyle. Look at the sports and violence, if you will. Football, and I'm talking about the football that we play in the West, where we crack and crunch heads and crunch bodies and destroy bodies. We look at the amount of impact that we do on our environment and the kinds of violence we do to our environment. Look at the impact of all of the violence that we see at the borders, if you will, and look at the violence and how we treat each other. Look at the political nature of the church and how that can be violence. I think we are in line with the Catholic Church here, especially the Pope, not necessarily the Catholic Church, but I think Pope Francis would stand in the place of saying that nonviolence is a way to go in terms of reforming the life of the church. Okay, so we're going to stop there. I want you to make sure that you review all of the lectures for this section. This will end our lecture for Walter Wink's The Powers That Be. Next time we'll be talking about Jacques Ellul.